I'll be speaking with Alexis Dudden. She's a professor of history at the University of Connecticut, a specialist in Japanese and Korean history, and a signer of the call for Olympic truce actions. She'll be speaking in New Haven at a teach-in and rally this Sunday, February 11th. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for talking to me.
Last year saw a series of threats and grim counter-threats from President Trump and Supreme Leader Kim over Korea. But this year there's been something surprising, an agreement between the two Koreas over the Olympics. Can you describe it?
It's actually quite a long-built fruition of positive diplomatic efforts of engagement and attempt at engagement. We know that the South Korean administration of Moon Jae-in has been actively seeking North Korean participation. It was one of the first things President Moon said upon coming into office last spring, that he would welcome North Korean participation, including, and invited them actually really noticeably to travel by land, emphasizing the proximity and interrelation of the two Koreas. And so then there was this really counterproductive tweet storm and bellicosity between both Washington and Pyongyang in a way that, North Korea has often had provocative rhetoric as a standard feature of its governance, international relations governance. But for the first time, the United States has chosen to play by Pyongyang's rule book, and in doing that, really sort of threw a lot of the standard fare of diplomatic norms out the window. Now, some may say that North Korea always throws things out the window. That may well be, but this is the first time that we've had a U.S. leader so willing to play by those norms. So we had this really destabilizing series of months in which, unfortunately, serious war plans have been really ratcheted up on the U.S.'s part. And in the mix, South Korea's President Moon Jae-in has made abundantly clear that regardless of what certain voices in Washington say about all options are on the table, war is not an option for South Korea or North Korea because any military action would lead to the utter annihilation of both Koreas. So as the leader of South Korea, he's not an appeaser. He's not a pacifist by any means. I mean, the man was in special forces himself. That said, he is saying we simply cannot have a war because my nation, my South Korea, would be obliterated. So we have to achieve a sensible, peaceful outcome to this heightened tension. That's all the surrounding context for his decision to really focus on the Olympics as the chance for this to be a multinational, truly highly internationally televised venue to emphasize the desperate hope for de-escalation of a potentially devastating conflict.
So I don't know if the opening march has already taken place because Korea is so far in time. Has
yes,
it?
I believe, yes, it has, and I've heard the NPR reports which describe the Korean athletes coming together under a unification flag, which is just sort of an irredentist picture of the peninsula in blue against a white background, and they're marching wearing jackets that say Korea rather than a designated north or south. And the crowds are apparently absolutely delighted to see this declaration of being Korean together, which I think is slightly different from what a lot of us have long called unification. I mean, we're really talking at this stage about recognizing a different way forward for the two Koreas, which is not necessarily the 1990s or early 2000s model of a blended place, but rather people who understand that they've got a shared ethnicity and language and now radically different worldviews and societies, but at the same time, as Koreans, they would like to work somehow together to get the international pressures removed. And I think that's following the Olympics. The test for the international community is really to understand how both Koreas might come into a state of coexistence in ways we haven't really talked about internationally before.
Mm-hmm. Now, coming back to this initiative, so they're going to have, what is it, a joint hockey team?
Yes, it's the women's ice hockey team, and it drew enormous criticism among young South Koreans because, and this really gets at the point of a new kind of unification or a new kind of joint Korea moving forward, because the South Korean government sort of de facto announced to the women's ice hockey team that they had to share their spots. They had to give up some of their positions to make room for North Korean athletes. And the coach, who's actually quite an interesting young woman, Sarah Murray, she's Canadian, and she just stared into the cameras and said, "What are you talking about? My girls have worked very hard." Mm. And then she sort of realized the larger implications, or the larger implications were made clear to her. And she said, "Okay, well, I understand the bigger picture, but I still need good players." And noticeably, the North Korean side understood the power of Sarah Murray and quickly sent their athletes so that they could get the most training with her. By Olympic Committee rules, she has to put on the ice 3 players from the North each time she fields her team. And I think it's going to be, we've already seen a match between the Korea team, which is skating as Korea. We've seen a match against Sweden, but the real one to watch is going to come for East Coast United States very early on Valentine's Day, and it will be unified Korea against Japan. Huh. And that's just, I mean, that's the optics for all of not just Asia, but really, post-colonial nations everywhere. But going back to this, the problem with the women's team is that a whole host of lingering social issues within South Korean and North Korean society led to the selection of this team. That is, well, we don't think they're going to win anyway, so who cares attitude that the committee members made in selecting the women's team, on top of which the men's team, also not expected to win, was never considered. So a lot of younger Koreans said, wait a minute, why do you just keep using us for your out-of-touch political ends? You should have at least had both men's and women's teams, or you should have picked more teams so that it doesn't just target this one group of athletes. And that sort of brought a lot of South Koreans, younger South Koreans, to question how the process of conceiving of 2 Koreas together would move forward. Played against the reality that leading into this moment, a substantial majority of South Koreans under the age of, I would say, 35, really view the future of Korea very differently from everybody over 35, precisely because, this is the group that has come of age knowing has no lived memory. They themselves were not refugees or in the war. On top of which, and far more to the point, is just the pure economics of the situation. The 1988 Summer Seoul Olympics witnessed an Olympics in South Korea that was not that much economically different from North Korea. The societies at that point, sort of looked a little bit different in terms of how they held their military parades and what kinds of educations they were receiving. But in 1988, you had the South Korean economy was not yet the explosive capitalistic success that it became in the years that followed. Obviously, the gears were in motion for that, but the standards of living were not that divergent at the time as they are today, when South Korea is the world's 11th largest economy and North Korea ranks below Haiti.
Wow.
So South Koreans under the age of 35 see this purely in terms of their future economic vitality, which already within South Korea confronts some of the world's highest youth unemployment rates, incredible debt problems in terms of mortgage and education fees. And so they really say, when the estimates for the cost of unification come in at a low park of $3 trillion, they say, wait a minute, how are we going to bear the financial costs of this in a way that is spread evenly? And they balk at it in ways that I think behoove all of us outside that reality to really figure out what Koreans want, both, and this also would apply to North Koreans, who are much, much more difficult to learn from and hear from. And yet, when one has the opportunity, for example, to listen to somebody who has left North Korea, whether it is a defector or a refugee, and I think those are different categories, but largely people in that category, especially if they are young, talk about their desires in the future to return to a North Korea to build a stronger North Korea. So the question is, when the North Korean leader talks in terms that Washington interprets as the absorption of the South, that may be true for the Kim dynasty in the North, but I'm not sure that the so-called average younger North Korean is seeing it in those terms, because I actually think that's impossible to measure given how few North Koreans one can meet. But it's also, North Koreans don't have access to so much information about what the South actually is. For example, it will be very, very difficult for the North Koreans to watch an unmediated viewing of the opening ceremony. So, for us to guess what North Koreans want is almost an impossible proposition. So we're left to glean all of these things like old-style Kremlin watching, all the focus on Kim Jong-un's younger sister. And I thought last evening on NPR, the correspondent in Seoul, Elise Hu, had a really good observation when she noted that this younger sister is the first member of the Kim inner circle ever to go to South Korea. I mean, in the history of the two Koreas, this is the first time that an inner member of the Kim family has traveled south.
Wow, so, yeah.
I know, and that's the kind of thing that we're really dealing with. We don't know how the future will unfold, but it's in everybody's interest to support the Koreas making those negotiations first on their terms. Then obviously international involvement is next, but this notion that we'll just, that the United States will just continue to dictate Korea policy to South Korea is arguably what got us into this mess in the first place 60 plus years ago, and what has sustained all of the tensions.
No, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say we just need to treat South Korea as an equal at the negotiating table, or no peace will hold.
Right. I know we're going to hear a lot more about this Sunday. My final question was about the Olympic truce actions, things in the United States. So, what is that effort? What is being called for?
Well, it's interesting because it began with a group of retired military people who wrote an open letter to Donald Trump saying that there is no military option for anything on the Korean Peninsula short of an all-out bloodbath. Even the most conservative casualty projections talk in the high hundreds of thousands of dead in the opening round. So this isn't, put it this way, and has long been said by many people, if there had been a military option in 1994 when the first round of understanding the scope of North's nuclear ambitions came to light, the United States would have taken a military action in 1994. But the logistics, that is to say, Pyongyang's ability to hold Seoul hostage, as well as all of the, not just, and I don't mean to sound strange, not just the Korean people, but the 28,000 U.S. troops and the now roughly 240,000 American civilians, there is no possible way to evacuate them without everybody knowing what the United States is going to do. So it's radically different from the build-up to the invasion of Iraq. So these military officials wrote Trump and said this is a non-starter, and called for building an awareness of the need for peace surrounding the Olympics, and have called for teach-ins and for people really to pay attention to these Olympics, even if they're not interested in the luge or downhill skiing, but just to get the optics of how close the Koreas are geographically. I mean, I've been skiing in Pyeongchang, and from the summit you can see straight into North Korea. So it's a little different from going to the Adirondacks or something when you really couldn't quite see Canada.
Well, this is great.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much more I'd like to ask, but we're going to hear from you at the event in just a couple of days. The event sponsored by Promoting Enduring Peace this Sunday. I really appreciate you talking to me.
I really appreciate your being interested. Thank you.